everybody. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk ASPM. Let's Talk Application Security Posture Management. This is the show where we talk about all things software security and application security and the best practices that go into shipping software securely and with speed. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Renan Diaz, who's engineering manager at VTS. Renan, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Raj. Thank you for having me today.
All right. Yeah, Renan. So Renan has a very interesting background. He started out as a computer vision researcher and then as a software developer and then as a cloud infrastructure engineer, site reliability engineer, a software architect, and now an engineering manager responsible for software engineering and then also the security engineering. Right. So it seems like Renan, over a period of time, has taken all the different pieces that are needed to be an effective software engineering leader and a security leader. Renan, can you please give a bit of a background about bit of detail on the background that you have and how your a typical work week looks like for you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I mean, I've been, I guess, all over the place in the tech industry, starting as a research and then transition to a developer. In the beginning, I was focusing more on developing iOS apps. And because iOS, there's a lot of like interface component, it was very natural for me to transition to working with front ends. And then as working with front end, always communicating with the back end. So then I started also working the back end at the same time. So I spent a couple of years working as a developer. And then at some point, maybe about like 8 or 9 years ago, I made a transition to focusing more on the infrastructure side of things. So that's when I started working with things like, infrastructure as code and building CI/CD pipelines and so on. And at that time, as I was working with infrastructure in this startup, and they had to become PCI compliant, I also came across compliance, right? So I was responsible for going through the controls and make sure everything was in place in the infrastructure, collaborating with the developers, handling the auditors and all of the sort of things, gathering evidence. And as time went by, I went through multiple roles, solutions architect, SRE, and every time that I would go through a new role, I was always curious about exploring the security side of it, right? So as a developer, I was exploring, okay, so how about secure coding? How do we do? What are the techniques or infrastructure? How do I secure an operating system or a network and so on? So yeah, so throughout all these years, I had always a big passion for security. So I was always focused on security in whichever role I was going through. And then now, fast forward to nowadays, I'm working as an engineering manager. I focus on security engineering. And so I'd say the typical week, it looks very, I would say, there's a lot happening, right? So because we have a lot of domains that we take care of. So we have, application security, we have cloud infrastructure security as well. So in a given week, maybe I'm going to be handling, code vulnerabilities, right? We're always looking to, introduce new tooling, new scanners. So that's one of the things that might be working with my engineers, or even maybe like doing some triaging if there is some, vulnerabilities that came from our tooling, or if we're doing some sort of penetration tests, we get a report. And then at the same time, there's also things that we got to do on the cloud infrastructure side, right? We also have scanners there. So there's always a lot of alerting on things that are happening. Sometimes if there is some sort of attack, we got to respond to that. So yeah, it's hard to say maybe a typical week because every week there might be something different happening because of the amount of domains that we take care of. But yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, like I got a sense of what it looks like, right? I'm like you have a set of scanners that you deploy, and they could be on the infrastructure side, they could be on the application side, and then there are a set of vulnerabilities that come out, and then you need to figure out a way to maybe prioritize them and then see which one to fix, which one not to fix, right? Yeah. All right, excellent. So, Renan, I see two beautiful guitars in the background. Are you a musician? Do you love playing music?
I tried many years ago. Yeah, I started learning as I was a kid. I started with classic guitar, acoustic guitar, and then I transitioned to electric guitar. And then at some point, I even tried the bass, also drums. Drums is something that I really love to play too. So yeah, I mean, I guess at some point I could say maybe I was a one person band. Yeah, music has always been part of my life, and yeah, really love playing whenever I get the time.
All right. Yeah, very good. Yes. So music, such an amazing part of our life, right? It can lift our spirits, at the same time, soothe our nerves, right? A great combination right there. And so actually looking at talking about music, right? I do see, a similarity between what happens in creating music versus creating secure software. And if you really look at a guitar, for example, it has what? A bunch of strings and it creates some sound. And when you have them playing in formation, music comes out of it. And if you play those sounds out of formation or out of rhythm, then noise comes out of it, really, right? So in many ways, I think that's what happens even in software security, because when you run the scanners that you're just talking about, there are a lot of uh, noise that can come at you. The scanners throw a lot of findings at you, and then you need to figure out what's noise, what's the sound, and you need to extract the right sounds out of it, and then give it to the developers so that what comes out of them is a secure software, right? Do you see that parallel between the music and software security?
Yeah, it's super interesting that you mentioned that. I never actually I never actually thought about it. But yeah, definitely. I mean, in terms of music, it like you said, if you just start, playing randomly, maybe you're just gonna have noise, right? But you gotta do it in a way that is coordinated, right? Not only yourself with the chords and the guitar and so on, but if you're playing on a band, you've got like maybe 4 or 5 other people playing together with you, and for you to have a music or a sound, everyone needs to be synchronized. Everyone needs to be on the same page. And that is 100% true for security as well, right? So if developers, they have no idea what you're doing, they have no idea about your tooling, you just come with them with tickets, then they're going to be, well, why would I spend so much time on this if I have so many other things to do, right? And it needs to be a coordinated thing. And I think that's maybe one of the things that a lot of organization might miss, is that they just focus on the tooling, be able to surface vulnerabilities, but they forget about the processes. They forget about the people that needs to be involved in the program, right?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great way to put it. So now let's talk about, you said, you talked about the scanners that are there in your tooling, and you put them in place because they are some kind, in a way, they are like telemetry into your software to tell you where there might be vulnerabilities, right? So can you tell me about the challenges that you see in uh, creating secure software and even using the tool sets that come with it?
Yeah, of course. So yeah, so in terms of scanners, so there are, multiple types of scanners that we work with and that you usually see out there, like static analysis, software composition analysis, DAST, and or even like IEC scanners and so on. So there is a plethora of scanners that you can deploy. But I think the main challenge there is not only deploying the scanner. I think that might be the easier part. But once you start, getting all these vulnerabilities and ingesting somewhere, you're probably gonna end up with a huge list of vulnerabilities, right? And so I think the challenge there is mainly prioritization, because what I've seen a lot happening are organizations that they only focus on, let's say, the severity of the vulnerabilities, right? So they see, I don't know, hundreds of vulnerabilities with a critical severity, and it's hard for them to know how to prioritize that, right? And so to give an example, let's say you have two hypothetical products. One of them handles, let's say stock market, which is public data, and the other one has material non-public information, which is like, corporate news or any sort of information about a company that is not meant to be public. And then if you have two vulnerabilities, they're both critical and affecting these two products, how would you know which one to prioritize if you're only looking at the severity itself, right? And so one of the things that we were trying to do, and that's one of the things ArmorCode has been helping us a lot as well, is to change the way we approach prioritizing. So we don't do it on a qualitative way. We also do it on a quantitative way, right? And so to explain what that means, basically, so we try to create risk profiles for each one of our products, right? And we try to take into account that risk profile when we're prioritizing vulnerabilities. So we don't not only look at the criticality or the severity, but also we try to give different weights for the product. So coming back to that two hypothetical example of, public data, stock market public data versus material non-public information, you would probably have a much lower weight on one product than the other, right? And then what we try to do is we take that weight that we assign to product, which are different weights based on what's the impact to the business that the product might have, and we take that into account when we're prioritizing. Yeah, so that's one of the things that I've seen and that we're trying to solve is, just to summarize the idea, is not only looking at the severity, but also take other things into account, especially the risk profile of the products. And just to finalize here as well, I know some people might say, well, but what about CVSS? That gives you a number. Maybe you could use something like that. But I think the main issue with that is that, that number has nothing to do with like your business, right? Whoever assigned that number to the CVSS, they don't know your business. They don't know what's, critical, what kind of impact that vulnerability can have in your business, right? So yeah, personally, I don't think that's enough. I think there needs to be something else. And that's how we're basically approaching here.
Yeah, excellent point that you make, bringing in the risk aspects to it, right? So you're now talking about taking a vulnerability and assigning risk to it based on the business value of that particular asset, right? So it is said that for a security leader, right, a security leader needs to be business leader first and then the technology leaders next, right? So what you just said, what I took away from that is that you have a very firm understanding of which assets are important for the business. Maybe there is a web application which cannot go down. Your business will be severely impacted if that application goes down. Then you need to make sure that that gets the right risk profile versus maybe another application which doesn't have any sensitive data or maybe doesn't have requirements for high availability, right? So then even though the CVSS assigned to that might be a very high, maybe a critical problem, but you don't care about it as much as maybe web application, maybe it's a moderate uh, severity CVSS, then you would assign a higher priority to fixing those problems. So that's what I understood from this. Uh,
that's exactly that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So in terms of, so one of the challenges that we hear very often is communicating risk to the business, right? So there are so many vulnerabilities. At some point, you need to communicate risk to the business. And do you have any best practices that you use when communicating? Because it's always a negotiation with the software developers, what to fix, what not to fix, right? Because they have limited time. So are there any best practices that you use to effectively negotiate with the developers on why they should be prioritizing something over the other?
Right. Yeah, I think like you said, it's very important to surface to the business the risks that we're talking about, right? Because if you go straight to the developers, if the leadership on their side, they're not aligned with what we're doing, there's nothing to back them up to say, yes, I'll solve these vulnerabilities, right? And so I think, and the approach that we take, we first start like a top-down approach. We communicate with the leaders first. They need to understand what we're doing in the first place. And also they need to understand what kind of metrics we have. And that's another important thing that I think some companies might miss as well, is that sometimes they have, the data is decentralized. It's like data is pretty much everywhere. Maybe they have 10 tools, and each one of the tools, they have their own dashboards, their own data, and so on. So it's very hard to gather information if you have decentralized data like that. And if you come with, let's say, the number of vulnerabilities only to leadership, that might not mean anything to them, right? Like back to what we we're talking about, creating a risk profile. So I think that's really the first step, is identify, like creating this risk profile for each one of the products, right? So that you can help you prioritize, better the vulnerabilities. And so then you need to find a way to centralize all of your data. Everything needs to be in one place, right? Because if not, I would say what ends up happening is that the security team ends up being the responsible for filtering everything, gathering all the data, and triaging everything. But I think this needs to be some a shared effort with the developers, right? And for that to happen, I think the very important thing is for you to be able to centralize everything, right? Which is exactly the way we use ArmorCode with, right? So we use ArmorCode to be able to centralize all of our data coming from multiple scanners in a single place. So that's one thing. And then another thing is like I said, it's not just about the number of vulnerabilities, but you got to have some other sort of metrics to be able to show to leadership and to the engineering teams. One thing that we've been exploring is a risk score, right? Which ArmorCode also helps us calculate. So based on all the vulnerabilities that we get, based on the risk profiles that we set for our products, a risk score is calculated, and we use that risk score to tell leadership how well or maybe not well we're doing in terms of the security of our product. And basically what we wanted to do is our goal is to reduce that risk score, which means reducing the risk of the product, right? And I think that's very important, is like it's being able to show a very like a solid metric to leadership so they can understand exactly where we are and whether the program is being successful or not. And then once you align with leadership, I personally think it's much easier to be able to collaborate with the developers, because then you have a very strong foundation, which is your partnership with the leadership, to be able to work together with the developers and solve all of these vulnerabilities.
All right, excellent. Thank you. Thank you for summarizing that, for giving an overview of that. So for me, so what I gathered is you have different scanners that you're working, that you have, that are sending you information about what they believe are some vulnerabilities in the software, some findings, right? And then you're using ArmorCode platform as a platform that aggregates inputs from all of those and then tells you, it takes the information that you have put into it about the importance of different products and applications, and it uses that to basically help you prioritize which particular problems to fix first, which problems to fix next. And that's the information that you use to basically communicate with the leaders on the risk that a particular software release has for the business, right? Right? Yeah. Yes. Sorry, go ahead. You're saying something.
And I also want to mention that one thing that really helps us as well is, you got to identify your products first of all. And then another thing is, if you have, let's say you have a product that, it's just a massive product. There's so many repos and so on. And then you find vulnerabilities. The hard part, I think, is to find what is the engineering team that takes care of, let's say, the component within that product that vulnerability is affecting. Yeah, because sometimes there's so many teams working on a product, you got to make sure you go to the right team. So the work that we've done, we spent some time doing that, is first, breaking down all the products into like smaller components, right? And we uploaded that to ArmorCode, all of this data. And then after that, we got to identify the teams, right? So which team is responsible for each one of the components. And then based on that, we're able to identify owners for those components, right? Security owners. And that's been really helping us to start a conversation, because then we align with the owners of these smaller components, and they know exactly about ArmorCode. They know exactly about all the vulnerabilities that are there. And I think I've mentioned this before, but it's very important that you don't hide your tool, right? Like you shouldn't just have your tool, all the scanners, and then just come up with tickets for developers. You need to educate them. You need to demo your tool, right? And here in my team, we try to be very transparent about the things that we're doing, the process that we want to follow, so that we have them on board. And I think that really helps. Once we show the tool, they can log into the tool and explore themselves, rather than just hiding the tool, for example.
Right. Excellent point. So now what you're saying is you're actually able to orchestrate the workflows from the vulnerabilities that come in to getting prioritized, and you know exactly which particular developer or the team should be fixing this particular problem. So that so is this whole thing automated in your case?
So we're getting there. It's not fully automated yet, but from the tooling of gathering the vulnerabilities, sending to ArmorCode. We already have all the data there in terms of the teams and so on. We haven't got to the point where the communication is automated, although we know the platform allows us to do that. But yeah, it's we're still on this journey that we've been talking about, and that's definitely one of the outcomes we want to get to for sure.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So once we have that, then you know, the developers, I mean, they're comfortable with their own tool sets, right? One, you create awareness about the tools that you're using, but on this side, I don't know, maybe it's Jira that they use for the ticketing system. They're comfortable with the Jira. They fix the particular problem, and the problem is fixed. Then it reflects back into your systems on a particular problem is being fixed or not. Then it becomes a total uh, loop gets closed from vulnerability being identified to getting assigned to getting fixed and reflecting back into your tool sets that this problem has been taken care of now.
Exactly. Yeah. So there might be like a manual step there, which is currently like the communication that there is certain vulnerabilities. But like you mentioned, once you resolve the vulnerabilities, everything's integrated in Jira, and then let's say you close a ticket, that automatically reflects back on ArmorCode, right? And that also updates the risk score that we were talking about, right? Which is one of the metrics that we use to show to leadership. And it will also try to leverage, functionalities to actually generate reports, right? Like weekly or monthly reports. So then, yeah, that part is very, very automated for sure. Because then as soon as we resolve vulnerabilities, the vulnerabilities are gone from the tool, that, reduces the risk score, and then automatically we generate a report that goes to leadership. So they know exactly, like maybe not real time, but, they're very up to date with where we are in terms of, the risk in general. So yeah, so I would say maybe we have like 80% of this, this whole journey or pipeline automated. There's a couple of things we're still doing manual, but yeah, that's why we love the tool. We love this workflow because, and me coming from a DevOps background, I love automation in general, so I try to automate as much as I can.
Yeah, that's awesome. So tell me, in terms of the now, if you whatever work you just explained, if you put it in context with what's happening in the world around us, right? So there is an increased adoption of open source software. They come with their own set of vulnerabilities, maybe use software component analysis to figure out what those vulnerabilities are. And then now we are talking about Gen AI, right? So there is a ton of code that's being generated, some maybe by developers. Who knows, in some cases, it may not actually be developers who are using this to create tools, right? So how do you think the work that you're doing will be impacted by either the supply chain developments that are happening and the Gen AI developments that are happening?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's definitely something we've been exploring more and more, especially the use of Gen AI with with this collaboration with developers, right? So one of the things that I've seen, that it seems to be like a trend these days is to leverage Gen AI to be able to suggest fixes for developers' own code, right? And you know what? Right. Sorry. Let's go back on that question. I just maybe yeah, I'll go. Yeah, very, very interesting that you mentioned Gen AI. So that's definitely something we're exploring a lot, and that's a trend that you see in the industry, right? So developers are using more and more Gen AI to be able to generate code, and I think there's a huge discussion out there as to how safe is the code that Gen AI is generating, and yeah, so and the way we're trying to like fight in a way is, and it might sound funny, but we're trying to use Gen AI to protect us from Gen AI.
There we go.
Right? So
It takes
so if you,
iron to beat the iron, right? Yeah. Mhm.
yeah, so if you think about developers using Gen AI to generate code at the same time, and I'll give a couple of examples that we've been exploring, right? So
Mm.
one example would be to be able to have some sort of plugin directly installed in the IDE that, as developers, write code, whether with Gen AI or not, that plugin is able to, suggest that there's possibly a vulnerability being introduced on this line of code here, right? And that's one of the things we're looking for, is to give an immediate feedback to developers, right? And that happens on like during on the IDE side. But
Oh,
also,
fantastic.
yeah,
Mm.
another solution we're been exploring is, let's say developers, they write a code with Gen AI or not, and then they create a pull request or a merge request with their changes, right? So what we're trying to, before, I think the approach was we let that be merged, and then we try to scan the code to try to find vulnerabilities. But now we're trying to bring feedback, like I said, as fast as possible, as close as possible to the developers. So right there on the PR, we've seen, for example, GitHub Copilot might be a good example of that it can, analyze the code, and then right there on the PR, it makes a comment, say, hey, this line of code here might contain a vulnerability, and then explains what the vulnerability is, and then it provides a solution to resolve that vulnerability, right? And that's why
Got
I
it.
mentioned that we're trying to use Gen AI to protect us against Gen AI.
Right, right, right.
But at the same time, I mean, and people might say, well, but the code that the Gen AI is generating, which is supposed to resolve the vulnerability, might also be insecure. And to be
Mm.
honest, I think we've always been there, especially with things like, Stack Overflow, right? Developers would always go to Stack Overflow, copy code, and go with that. So I think the level of protection we have to have is exactly the same, right? It's not just accepting the code that Gen AI is generating for us, but you got to test that. You got to make sure that is secure. I think it's a starting point, right? So if there's a vulnerability you never heard about and you see a block of code that could potentially resolve it, that is a starting point. It doesn't mean you should accept that as the answer, but
Yeah.
you can use that as, like I said, as a starting point for you to get to where you have to be, right?
Yeah, that's so very fascinating, the use case that you mentioned, right? So you're talking about the tool, in this case, looks like Copilot is actually, the Copilot is telling how the developers are developing. It tells this the potential vulnerability here. You need to take a look at that, right? So I wonder in future, so one of the criteria that's used for uh, prioritizing a problem is if a particular vulnerability has been exploited, right? If it's been exploited, then you definitely want to make sure that it is fixed, especially if it's on a system that's of high priority for you, right? So now, does the Copilot already have that intelligence to say, you know what, this particular problem that you're talking about is attached to this particular CVE and it's been exploited 5 different times? Does it have that capability already, or you?
Yeah, so I believe it does. At least I know that it can, because I mean, the Copilot basically leverages a database of information that already exists, right?
Right.
So to be honest, if it doesn't, I don't think it's we're far off from that to have to be able to do that. But I think it does. It's able to connect the vulnerability with the CVE, so that you know exactly what Copilot is talking about. So I think that functionality, if it doesn't exist, we're not that far off from having that in Copilot. But yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I wonder now. I'm just thinking about. I'm just looking into the future, right?
Mhm.
So the in the earlier conversation, you mentioned you feed the business intelligence or the importance of a particular application to a business in the ArmorCode platform, and then accordingly you build a risk profile, and accordingly you figure out which one to fix first and which one to fix next, right? So I wonder if there's a way for this particular intelligence to be put in the development environment so that when somebody is coding, for example, let's say a same piece of code is being written on a lower priority asset application versus a higher priority application, then that particular risk profile is already factored in when a particular recommendation is made. So for example, an IDE which has Gen AI integrated with it might say, you are developing a code, it has a vulnerability that's been exploited 5 times. And it can, if it already has knowledge about maybe this was the CVE that was the vulnerability that was used in this infamous attack in so and so company, right? With the potential impact of so and so. And by the way, you're working on a crown jewel application, you better make sure that this particular vulnerability is addressed uh, before you actually ship it, right? So I'm thinking that's the holy grail of how Gen AI could actually not only introduce vulnerabilities, but at the same time also block that vulnerability from getting shipped.
Yeah, I think that will definitely be a next step, because what I've seen, and we even like try to do some sort of POC with that, was, we're leveraging some of GitHub's technologies for scanning, and we're already able to connect what's happening with the tooling, that all of the vulnerabilities that it found, with the developer's IDE, right? So right there, where on the IDE where you can use Copilot, if you ask about vulnerability that was found by the tooling, it actually tells you about the vulnerability and the fix right away, right? So we already see that there is already a connection between, all this technology, that is happening on GitHub with the, ID of the developer. But I think, if I'm not mistaken, I haven't seen this case yet where it connects with the risk profile that you mentioned, because yeah, in this case, GitHub is not aware of the risk profile, because in our case, ArmorCode is aware of the risk profile, right? So that could be potentially a next step to connect to, let's say, ArmorCode. And from there, it understands about what's the risk for each one of the products, and take that into account when making suggestions back to the developers, right?
Yeah, this is fascinating. I just love this conversation. I think part of it is what's already there. Part of it is in some ways sci-fi, right? On what's going to come in future, what we could potentially do. In the Purple Book community that you're part of now. So we have discussions like this where let's talk about what are the best practices in, let's say, just specifically about Gen AI now, in implementing Gen AI and putting guardrails around it. So what you talked about is a very good example of using Gen AI to make your software development powerful, but also putting guardrails around it. And then we also talked about how it could be used in future to essentially make the whole development process so solid that depending on which particular application is being developed, the guardrails that need to be put around it are stricter, because it's just maybe the crown jewel of in an organization, right? So I can actually see a podcast episode coming out just focused on this particular topic, right? To get a few smart people like you together, and then we just have a go at it and talk about different use cases, how we can in future, like 1 year from now, 2 years from now, how do we build a secure development environment?
Yes, and this is definitely a hot topic right now, especially my team. Like I said, we are exploring Gen AI very heavily. So then that's one of the top things in our minds is how can we set up these guardrails that you mentioned, and also the best practices to make sure that we're using Gen AI, but in a secure way, right? So if that conversation ever happens in a couple of months or a year, I would definitely love to be part of it, because yeah, it's a very interesting topic that I've always learned. I've always loved like AI, machine learning, and now be able to use that within security. So that's definitely one of the things that it's exciting me the most these days.
Yeah, totally, totally. I can just imagine, just going back to the model that we just talked about, where there are a series of scanners, right? Multiple scanners, and then there's the ArmorCode platform, and then it is ingesting vulnerabilities from these different scanners. And now let's say there is another input that comes in from Gen AI, right?
Right.
Like aggregating all these inputs, then ArmorCode has a platform, has this intelligence about uh, all the uh, all the vulnerabilities that are coming in, but also all the Gen AI input that can come into the CVEs that have been exploited, and the kind of impact. Maybe it was used in the target exploit, for example, or the Equifax attack, for example, right? And then you have very rich business context that you can then use to communicate to your management and say, you know what, this particular problem needs to be fixed. You know why? Because this was the problem that was used in Equifax breach or some other breach, right? Then you have the attention of the management all of a sudden. You say, you know what, yes, let's make sure that you have the resources needed to fix this particular problem.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there with when you mentioned about business context, which is something that we currently don't have, right? So one of the main challenges also that we face is that we see so many vulnerabilities, and a lot of them, they're false positives that comes from all this automated tooling, right? And that's I guess the reputation from these automated toolings, that they generate so many vulnerabilities. A lot of them are false positive, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is we've seen that a lot of the severities that come from this tooling, they're they're not justifiable for the business, right? Sometimes the tooling says that it is critical, but maybe it's not critical for the business, right? Because the tooling doesn't have the business context. So yes, if we can get to a point where we leverage something like Gen AI to understand the business context, then understand the risk of each one of the products, and if we make that correlation with the vulnerabilities that we see, then we can easily and automatically get rid of the vulnerabilities that are false positives or they have the wrong severity. That's not only gonna shorten the list, and it's also, I think it's also gonna help us with our partnership with developers, right? Because I mean, for developers, the least amount of vulnerabilities we give them, better, right? Because they have so many other things to do. And that's one of the things that we're missing, because we still see a lot of companies spending a lot of people hours on triaging and make sure that, okay, this is a false positive, or this doesn't matter, this is the wrong severity. So if you can get that out of the way and be able to automate, just focus on the most important vulnerabilities, I think that would really be helpful for a lot of organizations.
Yeah, totally, totally. Yeah, I just love this conversation, Renan. As I said, I think there is a couple of conversations to be had just on how we can use Gen AI, and putting that in context with the business importance of a particular application,
Yeah.
and also making sure that the scanners that you talked about, they are automated, generate a ton of noise, so much so that they actually if you look at them standalone, they become very useless, because if they say everything is a problem, then nothing is a problem.
Yeah.
Right? So you really need this governance layer, a management layer that's separate from the scanners, that's integrated with the knowledge that comes from like Gen AI and also the business context that you have, so that this millions of dollars of investments that you have done into scanners all of a sudden becomes very effective, because now we have put the separate management, governance and management layer, and the business context and the Gen AI into that particular platform.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Yeah, very, very inspiring vision there.
Exactly. I'd honestly love to get there. I think that's really where we should be heading, because, and this been a problem for a long time. If you come to developer with like 500 vulnerabilities, they're gonna look at you, they're gonna walk away, right? Because who wants to solve like 500 vulnerabilities after you deployed your code 2 years ago,
Right.
And
Yeah.
so I think this feedback loop also has to be much, much faster, and that's something I think Gen AI could definitely help us.
Yeah. Renan, thank you so much. It's a very interesting conversation here. As I said, there are two more sessions just on this particular topic. Hopefully, you and I can get together, maybe in this podcast itself, or in the Purple Book community with the other experts, where we can have discussions around this and come up with some cool ideas on how to solve this problem in the future. But for now, I think we are about the time here. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you joining us here. And what you say truly was music to my ears.
Yeah, thanks for your time. Thanks for inviting me here. It was very enlightening conversation. I love talking about this topic. So anytime you want to talk about more of these things, yeah, just let me know. Thanks
All
so
right,
much.
thank you.